Greetings, I'm Kristian from Cinema Nova. Welcome to the Intermission Interviews. Today my guests are the Australian filmmaking couple behind such local favourites as Malcolm, The Big Steal and Matching Jack. Thanks for joining us, Nadia Tass and David Parker. Nadia, David, you've both been busy. Tell me about the short film that you've both made in the last couple of weeks during lockdown.
Oh, lockdown, we were climbing the walls and didn't know what to do with ourselves, so we decided to make David a star. And so he's the star of Trattoria Pascal, the little short film that we made in our house with just the two of us, our son John and his fiancée Corrie Sue. So we were both in front of the camera and behind the camera and doing everything in between.
Yeah, so I had to sit down and try and write something that was, around about 5 minutes. And so our son, John, who had escaped from New York with his fiancée, he runs one of the divisions of Facebook out of New York, but decided to skedaddle out of there when he saw the writing on the wall. So the four of us are cooped up here at home. And as Nadia said, we were climbing the walls. And the idea of making a film came up. So John and I wrote it, basically. But of course, the four of us had to do everything. So for the two of us, for Nadia and I, who are used to having a bunch of people around to help us do everything, suddenly you're doing the whole lot yourself.
That was really hard for me because I kept wanting to instruct somebody, but they weren't there. And then to be in front of the camera, oh my God, it is so difficult. I've rediscovered how much love and respect I have for actors. I hadn't acted in something like, 25 years. And so here I am doing it again. And it's really hard, but I loved it.
I love that it's given the two of you newfound respect for other people who work on your productions. That's really interesting. Well, how have you sort of seen things shift in terms of like how films are made in the short time that we've been dealing with this? What are you sensing is on the horizon in terms of how people approach cinema once we do get out the other side of the COVID crisis?
I think we're going to be a little slower at really getting into it because whereas we all want to get back in, the reality of COVID-19 and the fact that there could be somebody within the group who is carrying that, I think it's so, we're all so aware of it. And so, the distance that we're going to leave between us, I think will automatically create a lot of changes. The additional thing for me is that I'm in the process of finishing off a documentary out of LA, but I'm doing it all through Zoom. So now I've discovered how I can direct through Zoom. I have a shoot happening in Slovenia and Austria, like the border between those two. And tomorrow I have a shoot happening in Sydney. So I'm navigating my way through, okay, I can do Zoom with you guys at X time, and then with you guys at Y time, and I never leave my study.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how filmmakers approach intimacy and proximity, because even if something does go into production, perhaps at the earliest opportunity, actors and filmmakers won't be able to obviously work too close to each other. However, by the time that film might see the light of day, it's conceivable that then social distancing may have been relaxed. So it's possible that we might actually see a strange kind of, if you will, blip in terms of how films are made, where people are sort of always just a little bit further away from each other than that they might have been before and after.
Well, the two shots are going to be very strange, with so much dead space between them. Yes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Television world, even now, we hear that, Neighbours has been able to go back and start shooting, but Wentworth hasn't for obvious reasons. There's a lot more there's a bit more edge to Wentworth that requires requires a lot of close encounters, and neighbours can get around it.
Yeah, well, they can stay at the door and deliver their message.
They can shout across the court. Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I suppose only time will tell. And I think the thing that's great, and certainly that what I've found in the last couple of weeks in talking to filmmakers like yourself through the intermission interviews, as well as just over the phone or over Messenger, that there's a lot of people who are really taking inspiration from this, but also taking into account the fact that perhaps the current psyche is quite unique to this moment. So do you think that we need to reflect too much on what we're dealing with now, or do you feel that perhaps in time maybe we won't want to actually think too hard about what we've lived through?
Oh, I think we will always remember this time, us who are living through it. History tells us that when people went through the Second World War, they always brought up their experiences during that time, over dinner or with a grandchild or someone else. I think it's been such a shock, the fact that the whole world actually stopped, that it's so magnificently huge that I think we're not going to forget it for a long time. There will be times when people will say, oh, I don't want to think about that, of course, because it's too hard. But I do think we will remember it subliminally, if not obviously. It's fascinating that in history, the world wars have affected certain parts of the world, not the whole world, whereas this is one thing that actually affected everywhere. And we stood still for a few minutes.
I think one of the things that I'm finding, because I'm using this time to develop projects, and some are projects that I've already written and I am rewriting, and we've had long discussions about exactly this issue. Will we want to forget about this period, or do we just want to integrate it into the storytelling? And I'm with Nadia. I feel that it's had such an impact on us that it would be odd not to include it in a contemporary film now, to have some reference to it. So with one particular script I'm doing, I've started the film within the lockdown period in this world, and they come out of it quite quickly. But it actually gives it a sense of time that is relevant now. Strangely enough, though, after the bushfires, we have another project which is set on a farm, and because it bridged over the bushfire period, I went to the producers in America and said, "Listen, I think we should include, make it contemporary, build the bushfires into our story," and they were absolutely for it, because those remember the impact that it made in America. So I rewrote this script to include that, and Aboriginal involvement, the Indigenous backburning methods and all that stuff. Of course, I just finish and deliver that, and COVID-19 arrives. And then the question comes up, oh, can you have another disaster in there? So, which we have not done. We've actually sat it between the two, which is only a period of about 6 weeks or 8 weeks. But so it's an interesting dilemma from a writing point of view.
That's really interesting you raised that. One of the last films that I saw in cinemas before we had to close down back at the end of March was a new Australian film called Rams, directed by Jeremy Sims, with Sam Neill and Michael Caton in it. And that film, anybody who might have seen the trailer, deals with two things, and that is bushfires as well as the spread of a disease amongst a small rural population. And obviously this was made long before COVID occurred. But as I was watching it, the connection that I felt to the material as I was watching it, because of what had obviously just occurred with the bushfires and obviously what was just starting to occur with COVID, it had such an incredibly strong relevance to me that I was connected to it in a way that I may not have been had we been watching it under less stressful circumstances.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
so true. Because in that film, it's the animals, isn't it, that have the disease? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And obviously, it's great to hear the two of you are so active in terms of what you're doing with the available time. But to date, we've not really seen terribly much in the way of support for the local filmmaking industry in terms of government support in the way that, say, big business has seen support. Why do you feel that getting government support to tell Australian stories, whether it be for television or for cinema, why do you think that might be important in terms of rebuilding our culture and our screen culture coming out of this?
Oh, Lord, we absolutely need to be able to see ourselves in order to know the society that we live in. Through art, we can examine the pros and cons of our behaviour. I think it's so important that, that the rest of the world who's not involved in creating content actually understands that these things don't just appear when you turn your television on. Somebody has been working for a number of months or years in order for that content to be there at the push of a button. Now, I don't think people generally or the politicians actually understand the amount of work that goes into it. And I think it has to be presented and processed and seen as a business, that this is a business. The entertainment industry is a business, and it brings in, I'm not sure of the exact figure, but something like $6 billion a year into the country. Now, if that's the case, why is it less important than some of the other businesses? And people really need relief. At the end of the day, they do need to communicate with the rest of the world through the media. And so I'm kind of baffled by the lack of attention that the politicians who have been sort of dishing out the money, the lack of attention to the entertainment industry. I mean, we really have to present ourselves and be understood that we need the money to be able to continue, one, entertaining the world or Australia, and second, to actually hold up a mirror to the society that we live in and that we're creating.
Yeah.
It's certainly a measure for me also of us, our world, historically. So if a film was shot back in 1980s or 90s, it's a fantastic way to see our cities, our lives, the way we were. And whereas we can open up books and read, I mean, I think we're living in a different world now. We are so informed by the visual medium. And so to see a film that was shot in the 90s, we get so much more out of it, out of understanding the tone and the nature of who we were. And I think historically we've got to really maintain that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think you're right in terms of the fact that people do certainly rely upon the media in times of stress. Whether it's been during the shutdown or indeed in the way that people used to rely upon going to the movies for some sort of relaxation during the world wars. And I also subscribe to your idea that it's so important to capture moments and periods in history, because the opportunity to look back is essential for us to not only understand ourselves but to also share across generations the differences in Australia that we know now versus the one in the past. And I suppose with that in mind, I mean, a film that's one of my personal favourite Australian films is a movie that the two of you were responsible for, a film called Malcolm, which was made back in the 1980s, starring Colin Friels. And one of the reasons why I love watching that film is because I always like to look into the background and see Melbourne at that time and recognise things that are obviously still around or that have changed. Thinking about Malcolm, I mean, as a movie, for the two of you, what does it mean in terms of presenting the Australia then versus the Australia today?
There was so much more innocence then, both in communication and in our psyche. And it's just beautiful to actually watch it again and see how, the tram depots were in existence and see all the trams lined up. There was a way that each one of them would sort of come out of there like soldiers and go on their journey. It was, it's kind of beautiful to see the world that we came from. Recently, we had a retrospective of our work in Los Angeles, and that was one of the films that was being shown by the American Cinematheque. And I was very nervous to think that all the young people in the theatre there, in the cinema, were not going to really understand it. But pretty soon into the film, I realised just how connected they became with the narrative and with the world that we were presenting. So, they really appreciated it now. And this is a culture that's quite different and similar to ours. So it works. It seems to have come through the test of time.
Look, even today, we got this morning on ABC television, there was a piece about a fellow who lives in Albury, who's one of these Lego builders, and he had built that tram depot with all the trams based on Malcolm.
Wow.
And it was a news piece today in 2020. So how long has that film been? 35
years. Yeah.
36 years.
Yeah. No, it was extraordinary. So it's still certainly in people's memories, but it's also relevant as well.
Yeah, and I think that absolutely speaks to your earlier comments about the fact that obviously we can look back at these things and we can appreciate them. And I also really completely agree with the idea that it was a more innocent time. And frankly, what a wonderful thing to involve yourself in. Go back and look at a time when indeed Australia was perhaps a little more Pollyanna-ish than it might be under the current circumstances. Thank you both very much for taking the time to talk to us today. And all the very best with the rest of lockdown, and I hope it continues to be as helpful in terms of rewriting those scripts and getting things done as we emerge back into the world once we're through this. So thank you very much, Nadia Tass and David Parker.
Thank you, we'll be your first customers when you open up.